Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Single best idea, usually 6 minutes long. We want to fit it in as something you can listen to around your other longer podcasts like David Gura and The Big Take, among others. But today, we could do a 3-hour single best idea. The news flow today was absolutely extraordinary. In all my years of doing this, the number of stories, the coverage, the video tied into our radio product was just absolutely extraordinary. We're not going to touch it all today, but we'll try to get there. The ECB today cut their interest rate. They put out, it's very different than when the Fed puts out their headlines. The Feds are fewer headlines, more obtuse. The ECB wants to tell you everything in their headline dump. So they told us everything, including inflation and GDP forecasts. And then Christine Lagarde has to get up and reinterpret it. The euro was pretty stable, but within it was inflation that refuses to come down, maybe 2026, and a far more tepid growth. We spoke to Geoffrey Yu of BNY Mellon about the unique ECB calculus.
Animal spirits in Eurozone, I think, need to work off again where your financing costs are, real rates, what's the other side of nominal GDP, how high is your deflator? So if it's going to be driven by a high deflator and companies have pricing power, then they will be willing to move as well. Either that or you begin to reduce costs. Animal spirits, I think, two factors. One, financial conditions need to loosen more, but secondly, reliant on some degree of industrial policy, fiscal support. That's what the US and China have right now. Made in China 2025, the IRA, Europe is still lacking that.
Geoffrey Yu, and we, of course, talked to him about China is, well, I thought he was somewhat constructive on it and somewhat constructive on a global lift. But again, he was very cautious on establishing a disinflationary tendency over the rate cuts we've seen in Sweden, Canada, and in the ECB. Will the Fed cut next week? Nobody's talking about that. I don't think I'm going to editorialize there on that. D-Day was extraordinary today. Some good perspective there from Bloomberg News in Paris. Thank you to all for the coverage of that. Particularly major shout out to Michael Barr, who had to juggle an extraordinary amount of news flow. For those, of course, in New York, was the bombshell by the governor of New York of ending the debate over a congestion tax. That was a shock yesterday afternoon. And it's a local story, but it's got some national ramifications as well. One of the stories was in engineering and space, and we made a commitment to actually cover the miracle of space. And I'm not going to mince words. When I heard about this, say 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I was like, really? We really need to do this? I mean, it's, the guy over at Virgin Air and the rich guy from Amazon and this Tesla guy and PayPal. All that. And then Boeing got involved. They had, a successful list finally the other day. And it becomes a blur. And the one thing that's not a blur is the engineering miracle that Elon Musk is trying to do. And I'm not going to go into it now because of the brevity of the podcast. But when the thing takes off, SpaceX, you look up and it looks like a comic book in the 1950s because there are 33 rocket engines among the entire base engine. It's not Saturn. We need to talk to an expert, Keith Cowing, NASA Watch.
To be a nerd about it, it's asymptotic. You're getting closer and closer to perfection. You never really get there, but you have to get closer in order to have something that's reliable. And in this case here, I mean, you see some of the shots before the launch, and you see they have the next couple rockets and stacked like corn silos. I mean, they're making these things like consumer products. It's not the handmade one-off things that NASA does. This is designed to be launch, test, launch, test, launch, test. Every launch brings down the risk, gives you more confidence that what you thought you were doing right is, oh boy, it's watching the live feed now. This is really something.
Beautifully explained, and I think very different from our perception. And I can remember when James Michener wrote the book Space, he was so upset at the presumed perfection of the Apollo program after the terrible deaths of Apollo 1. And It became too perfect almost with the moon landings and everything, with Apollo 13 and getting those guys back to Earth. But there was a perfection, and the early space mission of Ranger, which crashed into the moon directly, was just a whole series of failures. And we have forgotten that the way you engineer in America is to fail along the way. And I don't know, I frankly have not been briefed if this morning's flight was considered a success or failure, but it was certainly something to cover. Thank you, Keith Cowing of NASA Watch, for that perspective. Maybe tomorrow will be less news flow. I think just maybe, I believe the president has a state dinner in Paris. Lisa Mateo will be covering that in its entirety. But far more, there will be Jobs Day tomorrow. We'll go beneath the headline data at 8:30, as we always do. Thank you, Commonwealth, for your support of all of our economic indicators. Look for us at Apple CarPlay. Thank you for listening to Apple CarPlay this morning on your commute and on Android as well. And on YouTube, search Bloomberg Podcasts. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcast. On Apple Podcasts, single best idea.